Newly entering into 2024, and Japan is already hit by an earthquake and a major airport disaster. Two aircraft colliding with one another, how did they not see each other despite being in one of Asia's largest airports? Only a few days into 2024, Japan Airlines Flight 516 is at Chitose preparing for a short flight to Tokyo. The aircraft being used for Flight 516 is a 2-year-old Airbus A350-900 registered as Juliet Alpha 13 X-Ray Juliet. Having its first flight on the 20th September 2021, the plane was delivered to Japan Airlines on the 10th of November 2021. This particular plane had 4,642 total flying hours by the time of the accident. The Airbus A350 is originally intended for long-haul flying, but with Japan Airlines, their current A350-900 fleet is configured for domestic routes, meaning they are more densely packed compared to an international-bound A350. On board Flight 516, piloting the plane is a 50-year-old captain with 12,662 total flying hours, with 1,071 of them being on the A350. With him is a 34-year-old first officer with 2,135 flight hours, 678 of them being on the A350. In the cockpit as well was a 29-year-old pilot undergoing training. They had around 1,663 total flight hours, with only 24 of those hours on the A350. Those hours on the A350 all came from the last 30 days before the accident. As of this video's production on May 2025, the pilot's names haven't been revealed yet as the investigation is still ongoing. With them are 9 cabin crew members handling the 367 passengers on board. Moving on, parked at Tokyo is a Japan Coast Guard de Havilland DHC-8 Q300 registered as Juliet Alpha 722 Alpha. This plane had its first flight on November 2007, but was later acquired by the Japanese Coast Guard nearly 2 years later in March 2009. The plane had 7,911 total flying hours by the time of the accident. In the cockpit of the Q300 is 39-year-old Captain Genki Miyamoto, who had around 2,951 total flying hours, 1,345 of them being on the Q300. Along with him is First Officer Nobuyuki Tahara with 6,309 total flying hours, 535 of them being on the Q300. Along with the 2 pilots are 4 other personnel aboard the plane: 39-year-old Communications Officer Yoshiki Ishida, 39-year-old Radar Officer Wataru Tatewaki, and the Maintenance Officers 47-year-old Makoto Uno and 56-year-old Shigeaki Kato. Nearing sunset on January 2nd, newly entering into 2024, Japan Airlines Flight 516 is parked at New Chitose Airport in Chitose near the city of Sapporo, Japan, preparing for a short flight south to Tokyo Haneda Airport. Flight 516 left the gate around 1600 hours before departing from New Chitose on 1627. Flight 516 then climbed until they reached 40,000 feet at around 1650. Their flight continued on as normal and they started descending as they were approaching Tokyo at around 1710. Meanwhile, parked at spot 957 is the Coast Guard Q300 preparing for a flight to Niigata Airport to deliver emergency aid and supplies. As, only a day before, on New Year's Day 2024, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake struck the Noto Peninsula. The earthquake caused widespread damage and over 500 casualties. The Japanese Coast Guard was helping assist with the rescue and humanitarian efforts towards the affected areas, and JA722A was one of those aircraft in helping deliver humanitarian aid. The Q300 left their parking spot at 1732, taxiing towards runway 34 right. While they were taxiing on Taxiway Hotel, they were transferred from a controller referred to as Tower West to a ground controller referred to as Ground East. At 1744.13, Ground East told Q300 to taxi to a holding point at Taxiway Charlie 5. As the plane turned to enter Taxiway Charlie, they were transferred off to another tower controller, hereby referred to as Tower East. They were then told to taxi to a holding point on Taxiway Charlie 5. However, the pilots recalled that they were also told by Ground East to enter runway 34 right, and that they were first on the takeoff sequence. As a result, the captain told the first officer to begin doing their pre-takeoff checklist once they were given clearance to take off. At 17:45:40, The plane entered taxiway Charlie 5 and the pilots turned on their anti-collision lights. At 17:46:26, the pilots received a radio communication from a correspondent in Haneda. During this communication, the pilots were called hearing a takeoff clearance from Tower East. As a result, on 17:46:46, JA722A entered and lined up on runway 34 right. At around the same time, at 17:43:02, Flight 516 contacted Tower East as it began approaching runway 34 right. Flight 516 was given clearance to land at 17:44:56, and at around 17:46:20, they passed 1,000 feet as they continued their descent and approach onto the runway. At 17:44:26, Flight 516 touched down onto the runway and the pilots proceeded to apply reverse thrust and push the plane's nose down. But as they pushed the nose down, only then did they see the small Q300 on the runway as it was being illuminated by their landing lights. Only a second later, at 17:47:27, Flight 516 collided with JA722A while they were still pitched 3.5 degrees up. The impact caused the fire to ignite from under the A350 as the wreckage of the Q300 was hurled 700 meters away from the collision point. The pilots on Flight 516 attempted to apply brakes to slow down the plane, not aware of the fire erupting from under the plane. Flight 516 began drifting to the side of the runway, colliding with the runway and poppy lights before coming to a stop at around 17:48:14, 2,300 meters from the end of runway 34 right. In the Q300, 5 out of the 6 occupants were killed, with only Captain Miyamoto surviving, albeit with burns covering his body. Miyamoto escaped via a hatch above the cockpit before running off to a grass patch to the side of the runway. He then contacted the headquarters of the Coast Guard in Haneda from his own phone to inform them about the crash. Miyamoto was later transported to the hospital to be treated for his injuries. Meanwhile, on Flight 516, the pilots ordered an emergency evacuation, but the in-flight communication systems were broken, so the crew members had to use the megaphone or physically shout to the passengers to give evacuation orders. Flight attendants urged passengers to cooperate and stay calm, with footage inside the cabin showing passengers evacuating, notably not holding any hand luggage, which could delay evacuation efforts. The evacuation was completed 11 minutes after the crash at 17:58, despite the fact that only 3 of the 8 evacuation slides could be used due to the fire. Miraculously, all 379 occupants on board Flight 16 survived, with only 5 people sustaining injuries. Fire rescue and ambulances quickly swarmed both wreckages, with controls redirecting approaching planes to other nearby airports such as Tokyo Narita, Nagoya's Chubu Centre Airport, or Osaka's Kansai Airport. Japan Airlines Flight 166, a 737-800 coming from Akita that was behind Flight 516, had to go around before diverting to nearby Narita. Operations at Haneda Airport were suspended for a few hours as the fire and wreckage were being controlled. The other 3 runways were later reopened by 9:30, with runway 34 right being reopened nearly a week later on January 8th. As of May 2025, the investigation into the collision between Flight 516 and JA722A hasn't been fully completed yet. The investigation is headed by Japan's Transport Safety Board, or JTSB, assisted by France's BEA, the United States' NTSB, Canada's Transport Safety Board, along with representatives from Airbus and de Havilland. They released the first interim report on the 24th of June and a progress report on 25th of December. In the reports that have been published, the main factor in the crash was the pilots on the Q300 entering the runway without permission, as the captain mistaking Tower East saying that they were number 1 on the departure list as a takeoff clearance. Along with that, the pilots of Japan Airlines 516 nor the controllers noticed that the Q300 had entered runway 34 right, as Tower East was preoccupied with other aircraft and Flight 516 was focusing on their approach. Pictures taken from a simulation of the approach of Flight 516 also showed that the Q300 was virtually invisible from the point of view of the pilots on board Flight 516, added by the runway lighting masking the Q300's own lights. In the report, it also showcased some issues with the emergency response, with vehicles being delayed and a lack of personnel, with fire engines and ambulances stuck waiting, some for around 30 minutes. Along with that was the miscommunication between the different responders, with each agency having different radios leading to slower communication. As a result, the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, or MLIT, would revise their emergency guidance procedures and requested that related companies or agencies increase the amount of people available to respond to emergencies, particularly around nighttime or the holidays. In the aftermath, some action has already been taken with the release of the interim and progress reports, with some of the precautions being adding brighter colors and stop signs before runway entrances in airports across Japan, and controllers not saying the number in the lineup of the aircraft, as it was believed that JA722A mistook being told that they were number 1 on the departure list as takeoff clearance. A new air traffic control post was also installed, with them being in charge of monitoring the movement of aircraft across airports. Japan Airlines also announced that they were considering preserving the wreckage of Flight 516, similar to what they did with the wreckage of Japan Airlines Flight 123, which crashed 39 years earlier in 1985, as a reminder to employees to prioritize safety in their day-to-day operations. Hey guys, so the latter part of this episode was made when I was not feeling very well, you can tell from my voice, and for the last part I was sort of struggling to speak, so for a while I might just be focusing on my animations for a bit, and also because I want to take a break, except for a special episode that I plan to upload within the next month or so. So that's it. Bye guys. I gotta do my high pitched thing.